Welcome to the third webinar conducted by Education for Global Peace. We're so happy to have you with us. My name is Michael Minch. I'm a professor of peace and justice studies at Utah Valley University and a member of the board of directors of Education for Global Peace. And I'll be co-moderating this webinar. It is about police brutality. Today we're focusing on police brutality in the United States. It is about resistance to that brutality and transformation of it so that we can organize and reform political and social structures that get beyond that kind of policing to more just policing. Today we are delighted to have three guests with us who will, it'll be exciting to hear from them. Jackie Campbell is a professor at Northeastern Illinois University, where she teaches justice studies and also teaches law at a local law school in the Chicago area, and is also a retired police officer. David Ragland is the director of the Grassroots Reparations Campaign and a member of the Living Traditions at the Stony Point Center and a co-director and co-founder of the Truth Telling Project of Ferguson, an organization that was created out of the aftermath of the killing of Michael Brown in Ferguson a few short years ago. And Alex Itali is a professor in the Department of Sociology at Brooklyn College and an expert in and policing, has written much about it. So thanks so much for being with us. I want to say a few brief words about EGP before I turn this over to Maria Paula. Education for Global Peace exists because we believe that we will not have a sustainable, resilient, and peaceful future unless people are educated into the ways of peace. We are informed and educated, all of us in almost all of our societies, into the ways of conflict, and not peaceful conflict, but zero-sum conflict. And we realize that if we want to have a peaceful future, we'll have to do education differently. And so our organization is dedicated to mainstreaming and educating others about the multitudinous ways to do peace education and do it innovatively. And that's what our organization is about. And so you can find us online at Education for Global Peace, learn more about us, and tell us if you might be interested in working with us. So with that said, I'm going to turn the time over to Maria Paula, who can introduce herself and say more about today's webinar.
Thank you very much, Michael. And again, thank you all of you, and thank you for accepting our invitation to participate in this conversation. My name is Maria Paula Onigarro. I am originally from Colombia. I'm a political scientist, and I've been part of EGP for about a year and a half now. As member of EGP, one of the projects in which I participate is Peace Lesson Talks. And this webinar is part of this project, which is basically a space of analysis and reflection about everyday social, political, and economic events related to peace and violence that take place around the world. So basically what we do is we convene a space for discussion of such events and their positive and negative impact on peace building possibilities. Today, we're going to be talking about police brutality, as Michael already said. And this is taking into consideration like recent several events that have been occurring in the world, but focused, yes, in this case in the United States. The main reason being what we also happened on May 25th, when George Floyd was murdered by a police officer with the complicity of 3 additional officers in Minneapolis. So this murder triggered protests that were organized rapidly and that spread into large events with hundreds of and thousands of participants across the United States and the world. And since then, we've seen protests that are still going on against police brutality, and also an affirmation that Black Lives Matter. So in this sense, we're experiencing a challenging but somehow exciting moment that may turn out to be of historical importance. In this context, peace educators and peace builders have been asking one another, what can we do and what must we do in such a moment? EGP is responding to these questions by providing precisely this scenario to do so, to talk about what has been happening, but what possibilities we see at the moment. So this is the reason why we invite you to participate in this discussion. And yeah, so we may now start, and I now turn this over to Michael. Yeah. Michael.
I want to begin by, thank you, Maria Paul. I want to begin by throwing a question out to all three of our guests, and Alex, if you would answer first. We're all aware of police brutality in the United States, primarily against people of color. But I wonder if there are various forms of brutality that occur, and if the targets of that brutality are not just the people of color, as I put it, but some kinds of people more than other people. And I'm also deeply interested in the motivations of and the causes of that brutality. So there's a cluster of questions there, and if Alex, if you would begin, I'd appreciate it.
So yeah, let's think a little bit more deeply about even this term police brutality. So police are violence workers. That's what differentiates them from other government workers, is the capacity and the authorization to use violence. And most of that violence is in fact legally authorized. In fact, this is part of the reason that we see so few convictions of officers for acts of violence, is because the violence is actually legally authorized. So to say police brutality implies that the violence is somehow inappropriate or unauthorized. So in technical circles, we talk about excessive use of force, for instance. So force can be lawful, but then there can be force that goes above and beyond that. So that's like the typical way that academic researchers and police policy people talk about this question. But in a sense, I want to turn it back on its head again and ask, well, why have we turned so many problems in the United States over to violence workers to solve? Mass homelessness, mass untreated substance abuse and mental health problems, failed schools, widespread economic precarity that drives people into black markets of drugs and sex work and stolen goods. And we've turned all of these social problems over to violence workers to manage. And then we quibble over whether or not the violence is legally appropriate. Can we reduce the violence by tightening up the legal regulations, by giving police de-escalation training or mindfulness training? My view is that we have to do everything we can to quit using violence workers. Because if we don't want violence, we should do everything we can not to get police involved in the first place. We should have more counselors in the schools. We should have better public health interventions. We should have family support centers. We should have community violence interrupters, mental health workers, etc., where violence is not at the center of how they address problems in our society.
Great. I appreciate that. Thank you. Professor Campbell?
Hello. I was just trying to just take a few notes on what Alex said because I was interested in his description of police officers as violence workers, and it struck me as quite strange because when you look at the side of a police car, the thing that you see on the side of a police car is maintain order and preserve the peace. So I think that if you looked at the average police officer, they wouldn't even characterize themselves as a violence worker because they are thinking, I am here to maintain order and to preserve the peace. That might be part of the problem. And I do agree with the fact that we've made the police the agents to deal with all types of social problems that we have that perhaps could be better handled by other agencies. I think that one of the things with policing, at least I policed for 27 years and I retired as a lieutenant with a large metropolitan police department. One of the problems also, in addition to just throwing things to violence workers, since we're going to use that term, instead of the agencies that need to handle it, another problem that I see in addition to that is the way that police officers are trained. And I spent several years at the police academy training police recruits. And one of the things that I see is that police officers, when as part of their training, and most of the police departments will use this when they try to define, when we talk about reasonable and necessary force and what is considered excessive force, most police officers, they don't see people. They're trained to see subjects' actions. So they only, like you'll say, I don't see a robber, I don't see a murderer. I see three types of people in my life: cooperative subjects, resistors, and assailants. So everything is geared towards what that officer perceives that subject to be doing. So now we have now depersonalized that whole encounter because I'm not looking at that individual as a person with perhaps a mental health problem. I'm looking at the fact that this person is flailing their arms and they're presenting to me what appears to be an uncooperative movement for me to try to gain control over that subject. So, you know, violence workers and the responses and having all of these different duties that they have that should be with other agents. And I would add on to that the fact of how we're trained not to even see these people, but simply to respond to actions that we see that these people have. And that's going to judge whether or not what they did is reasonable based upon the totality of the circumstances, which is what's coming from the case law, at least in Tennessee versus Garner and Graham versus Connor. So,
You know, Jack, if police officers typically and overwhelmingly in our society see people in as they are congruent with categories and they sort of depersonalize the people they're interacting with, then it seems to me that begs the question of why do people of color receive different kinds of treatment from police officers so often as opposed to white people when they are conducting themselves in exactly the same way that white people conduct themselves. Can you
yeah.
speak to that?
I can. I think that, you know, like I just used the example. I used the example about seeing three different types of people because when you look at how the courts have interpreted what is considered, when you deal with that question of excessive force and how the courts have looked at what is considered reasonable, this is the thing that they've proposed, these police departments, in response to this case law that says we're going to judge what a police officer does based upon what is objectively reasonable. And so when you look at people of color, and I'm just going to use this because I think I heard it when I was listening to the debate the other night. Some people have characterized, I'm an African-American woman, and some people will characterize me when they look at me as an quote unquote angry Black woman. You know, when I respond to things, when I enter a room, even my gestures, my voice, it carries something. So I don't want to say unconscious bias, but the subjective bias that police officers will automatically see me as an African-American woman, that goes into the category in addition to whatever my actions are. So I'm not just perceived as a person who is a resistor because I'm not responding to the verbal direction of the police and I'm moving to avoid physical control. I'm seen as an assailant because my body language, my actions and the preconceived notions that police officers have about people of color has somehow influenced these three categories and made me a more dangerous subject than a white person. That's just my view.
Thank you. I suspect it's not only your view, but thank Dr. Ragland.
Hi, such a pleasure to be here. I want to kind of like pick up where Michael, where you kind of asked a question to Dr. Jackie and Professor Jackie, and I would start with that, and even pick up on some of what she was saying, that Black folks don't do the same things as white people. In most cases, we follow the law because we have to be hypervigilant. We've been taught to be hypervigilant because we know that we're being observed. And if we think about the Slave Fugitive Act and the history of policing, or at least the way that the current institution of policing emerged from general white people being asked to detain and question and observe white people on behalf of the planter class, in addition to police and law enforcement participation in racial terrorism throughout the South and the North, when Black people came escaping the South because of racial terrorism. And then police unions, which are unlike any other unions in terms of facing the same kinds of scrutiny and government and business intervention, in addition to things like qualified immunity, and then the relationship that police unions and police have to our legal structures and politics, and the way politicians use law and order frameworks to stay in power. My assertion is that, like, we protested, wrote policy, and lobbied for reforms for things like police, cameras, and for minimizing use of excessive force. And, for me and for many of the people in my circles, we are focused on police abolition. Like going along with what Alex was saying earlier, the reliance on violence workers to solve our social problems shows a lack of creativity.
Did
Dave,
he freeze or did I freeze?
Yeah, you're frozen, Dave. Let's move on and see if Dave can unfreeze. Well,
And a lack.
what's that?
I'm still here.
Oh,
Can you all
okay.
see me now?
Go ahead.
I don't know what was I saying. I was saying that the use of violence workers, for instance, to solve most of our society's problems reinforce that at the top, there's not a real interest in solving problems or dealing with issues like poverty. So, for instance, Jennifer Milstead, in her book, where she describes the way that the Nixon administration began minimizing social safety nets and corralling people of color into jobs like policing and the military, as a way to provide the only way out of poverty for many communities is deeply problematic, and just reinforces that the communities of color aren't actually a priority. We're just kind of like an afterthought and a group that needs to be controlled. And that spoke to me also during the Ferguson uprising and so many protest movements that I've been a part of, which showed police as occupying forces in communities, often using the same militarized equipment that was used in places like Gaza, Palestine, against the occupied people of Palestine. And many of those police who police our neighborhoods, don't live in our neighborhoods, and even those who do treat our communities brutally because of the specific policy decisions around how our communities are perceived and cared for. So I think the problem is actually policing itself, and we need to abolish police in this country, and we need to abolish the inner police. Why do we need to be policed? In many societies, communities take care of each other. There are restorative practices that communities around the world and the US has been using. And the myth is that we actually need police. But we do, because we've set up a society of rote behavioral kind of carrot and stick, right? Where if you don't do this, you get punished, as opposed to you're a full participant and human in this system and you deserve human dignity.
Okay, thanks. We have an exciting beginning to our conversation because from someone who trained police officers as a former police officer to someone who wants to get rid of police departments altogether, at least as they now exist. And in your comments that all three of you gave were embedded sort of enticing ideas about reformation. And so let's turn to the rest of our discussion towards what we can do. We've already turned there a bit, but what can we do to respond innovatively? And Maria Paula, I'm going to turn it over to you here.
Thank you, Michael. Yeah, so keeping up with the discussion, I would like to ask you, like you, David, already started talking about like protest against police abuse and different demands in that sense. But in this specific moment, have you seen, and if so, which forms of resistance that are now manifest in the US that demand that kind of change somehow, being like different levels of change in the police system within the country?
Let me just speak to what I think I understand your question asking. So I just want to clarify, I'm interested in abolition, not reformation. As I said, we've tried over and over. We begged police, please be nice to us. Please treat us better. Please train your officers not to kill us. You all have to go. And you know, I think that's just a matter of basic survival. And so if you look at Oakland, for instance, you know, Oakland, the Black Organizing Project has organized for over a decade and was recently the first community in the country that were able to remove school resource officers or police from their schools. And if you look at the policy that put police in schools, it was mismatched according to race. So for instance, you had the Columbine type shootings, which were the demographics were white single shooters or white shooters with you know, maybe some friends who supported that, which emerged zero tolerance policy. But yet we see metal detectors and police spring up in Black communities. And then at the same time, the white schools who fit those profiles don't have that. And we see continued police shootings. So we see not just in that level of continuous mismatch of policy and practices based on the actual reality. And they all swing according to the way that racial politics or work in our country. We saw that in the war on drugs, which was essentially a war on Black people. And so in this point where we're dealing with issues, the opioid epidemic, they weren't white folks who are out in the country, rural areas or wherever they are using the opioids don't face the same violent, life-changing sort of impact from law enforcement and politics as Black folks have in our communities. I saw my own community in St. Louis torn apart because there was a care there wasn't a care for the people. There was only an interest in keeping people in order per se, or making money from private prisons to incarcerate people. And so there's an economic benefit to violence workers as well. And so the movements that I've been involved in have tried to uncover and break apart the way that the weapons manufacturers lobby politicians who and the people who are who work and build prisons, lobby politicians. A number of people in Congress right now have a deep interest, economic interest in the way weapons are weapons manufacturing and manufacturing and building of police and supplying those institutions. And so there's a direct correlation between the way that police operate in our communities and imprison Black and brown folks in the United States.
Thank you, David. I don't know if either Professor Jackie or would like to add something or to this.
Yeah,
Professor Alex, sorry.
I'm sorry, if Alex, you wanted to speak first, you could. I wait.
Alex?
No, that's quite all right. Go ahead.
Okay.
All right. So I'm going to respond to what David just said. Basically, we need to abolish the police is what I heard him say. And what I see as a problem is the fact that the police and the law are so intertwined that to take one, the police, the reason that the police to get away with the things that we call excessive force is because the law is basically justifying everything that they do. I can give you case by case example. You'll hear this language, reasonable and objective. The reason that we've seen cases where someone is able to kneel on somebody's neck is because the law is supporting that. So one of the things that I would also like to see is that, first of all, there's an awareness that the law is allowing police officers to do what they do, a lot of it. And so abolishing the police is just one aspect of it, because you still have to look at those statutes. So for instance, if you say that a person can't, if we have a law in society, for example, and this is just an example, that you can't steal somebody else's property, you can't burglarize somebody else's house. So that's the law, and the law is going to put some type of penalty behind that. Now, I understand where you're coming from, David, where maybe we don't need to criminalize every behavior, but the law is allowing police officers to do what they do. And you can get rid of the police, but until you change the structure of the law, the problem is still going to exist. They're going to still have cases where people are being killed by police officers, because when we look at these statutes that are saying when a police officer has a right to use deadly force, they're not changing the statute. So maybe educating people more on what the law is, the law's hand, and what's actually going on, as opposed to just focusing exclusively on what police officers are doing, but showing up how the law is instrumental in maintaining the behavior to keep it going on, because it's not going to change. You might take George Floyd and his situation, but if you don't change that law, you're going to have another situation just like that.
Well, I certainly agree that this problem is not going to be solved at the level of the police. This is a political problem, right? The law reflects the will of political officials, of legislatures, etc. The police did not create the war on drugs. The police did not defund the schools. The police did not defund mental health services. These were political decisions. And then politicians turned those problems over to the police to manage, and basically gave them free rein to use whatever mechanisms they want to. So the question really is, how do we move forward? I don't think we move forward with implicit bias training and de-escalation training and body cameras, right? As David mentioned, we've tried that. That does not work. What works is replacing policing in very concrete, targeted ways that will actually make communities safer than they are today. We create family supports to reduce domestic violence. We create violence interrupters, youth programs to deal with youth violence. We put counselors and restorative justice programs in the schools instead of school police. You know, we create community-based mental health services so that we don't have so many mental health crises that end up involving the police. And this means that we need to consult with communities, community by community, about what the public safety challenges are that they face and begin to develop with them these concrete alternatives. This is what's being talked about in Minneapolis as a process, and I think this is very encouraging. Police abolition is not that there's some magic switch and tomorrow we just poof, all police are gone, and then we figure it out from there. There is no such magic switch. No police, no city government is going to zero out the police budget. What's going to happen is that we're going to be pushing politically legislators, mayors, governors to develop these alternatives to policing and to pull resources out of policing, out of courts, out of incarceration to help pay for these new community-based interventions.
So no one is suggesting that abolition of police is a magical switch that gets turned, or that policy isn't, and the legal framework isn't what we focus on. The definition of police abolition is abolishing the structures that reinforce the racist violence of the institutions, acknowledges the history, and deals with the surrounding institutions that make policing the way that it is. So I really think that we should pay more attention to what the activists in the streets are doing and saying, because if it's not for them, the laws don't get changed. The pressure has to be there. And there are folks who've been working on this community by community for decades and decades.
Let me ask all of you. So we can agree that policing, as it's now conceived and operationalized, needs to be abolished, and the most radical view is that policing, however it's conceived, has to be abolished. And
white supremacy needs to be abolished.
Yeah. But the realities are there's got to be process. There have to be steps. Wherever we get to, that's a better place than where we are. The fact is we're going to have to work with communities for whom this conversation would be so challenging to them. And so my question is, I'd mentioned to all of you weighing in, whoever wants to go first, feel free. I'm interested in how we would communicate what we need to do to constituencies that would have a very hard time hearing what it is we have to do. How do we, it's like the climate change problem. We know, those of us who are deeply concerned about climate change know what we need to do when we know our fundamental problem is communicating what we need to do to people who are reticent to doing anything. And all major societal problems have this problem front and center. So help us and our audience to understand what practical things do we do to make change going in the right direction when we have to work with constituencies who are white supremacists. Well, I mean, who are maybe not white supremacists. They're obviously a problem unto themselves. But the conventional structures that exist, how do we transform those conventional structures, both in our thought wise and politically and culturally? I'll leave that open. Who wants to go first?
Okay, can I?
Jackie, would
And
you
I'm
like
just
to
talking
respond,
from
please?
I'm just talking from a practical standpoint, so I'm not being theoretical or anything. But when I look at the reality of where I policed for many years, for 27 years, um, we would respond to all types of jobs. We would respond to, like, a job is a sister inhalator. The ambulance has a call of somebody that's having a heart attack. The police officers would have to respond with the ambulance to that job. Somebody didn't take their medication and they need to go to the hospital because they need to get some type of consult going. The police would respond to that. A kid didn't get up and go to school in the morning, so somebody would call 911. My kid didn't go to school this morning, and I want the police here. The school's called because somebody was acting up in class. They were throwing a pencil at some kid in school. The police are called to all of these different types of jobs, which other agencies are better able to handle. From a practical perspective, you stop giving those types of assignments to the police and you fund the agencies that are better equipped to handle that. So should police officers be responding to somebody that's in mental distress? No, because if you look at the reality of it, if I just told you that we're training police officers to identify people based upon their actions, and we only see 3 types of subjects: cooperative subjects, resistors, and assailants. If the person hasn't taken their medication and they're flailing their arms, a police officer doesn't see a person in need of mental health. They see an assailant, and they're going to use the force options that go along with that particular type of subject. So that's the last person that you would want to have responding to that type of job, because they're going to be focused on that subject's actions and not what's actually going on in that person's head. You can do all of the de-escalation training that you want. Let's sit around, let's do this, let's do that. But at the end of the day, when you say, hey, the police shouldn't be responding to these types of 911 calls, we're gonna take those calls and give it to the agencies that are better suited to handle, which means that the police lose part of their budget as a result of that. That's just a practical standpoint from what I see.
Yeah. Alex?
Well, you mentioned the importance of communication here. And it is true that a lot more work needs to be done to communicate clearly how to move forward on this. But we also have to remember that power is involved here. And of course, with the climate change issue, it's really more an issue of power than one of messaging. The majority of the American population is already sold on the idea that the climate is changing, that something dramatic needs to be done about it. But the fossil fuel companies, the airlines, other major, very extremely powerful interests have a stranglehold on Congress and prevent these changes from happening. And that is a question of power, not a question of messaging. Now, for this elimination of policing, defunding the police abolition, there is a question of messaging, because the reality is, for 40, 50 years, communities, especially communities with very real problems, have been told they can only have one tool to address their community problems, and that's police. And that's why, as Jackie pointed out, every problem under the sun becomes a police job. And then they hear from Trump and right-wing commentaries, and they just see a protest sign and they think, oh, you're going to take away the police, which is the only tool we've ever had. And for some people, that's very frightening and disconcerting. And so what we've seen, for instance, is a lot of African-American elected officials at the local level leading resistance to defunding the police. So the communication needs to be at the community level, talking with people about what these alternatives would be and how they would actually make them safer than they are today in a system that's dominated by intensive and invasive and violent policing.
David, any thoughts?
Sure. So I do agree that, the only tool that's been given to communities of color were police officers to respond to every issue. Um, and that it will take sort of a change in power. And, for the Truth Telling Project, our co-founder Cori Bush was just became the Democratic candidate for the first congressional district, and part of her work is explicitly dealing with and responding to Black leaders who were often in the pockets of these national lobbyists and interests in order to actually be able to reach people to see what it is that people want and need. The assumption also is that communities don't know what they want and need, and they do, because if I remember when Kajimi Powell, who was killed by the St. Louis Metropolitan Police within 5 seconds of their arrival because they saw an assailant, which is often what police see when they see Black people. Because I remember being held at gunpoint by Chicago PD because they thought a shoe in my back seat was a gun. But, I think that on the ground level, communities have been demanding what it is they want. For instance, in places like Richmond, California, where there was one of the highest murder rates for a small community like that, they were able to, with violence de-escalators and people who were working on issues like that, go in, look at the data and target people who were who had committed crimes before with things like job opportunities and funding and things like that. And I think that overall, it's always been a matter of, are we interested in developing this community? And the answer has usually been no. And often Black leaders in our community were complicit in that. And there are a number of activists and people right now who are shifting that leadership and making it clear that we won't tolerate Black leadership complicit with the white power structure any longer.
Can I just add one thing, just
Sure.
on the tag end of what David just said? So I think that one of the things that I think needs to happen is that the community, when we talk about things like, abolition of police, they need to understand that, because this is going to affect them. I know where I live in Chicago, we have had at this point in the year over 500 murders. And most of those murders have happened in communities basically on the south and west side of Chicago. Basically, the 11th district, the 15th district, and I can just go on and on. I live in one of the districts that's leading the city in murders. And so I think people that live in these communities want to know, because they are affected by this violent crime, what's going to happen when you do this? Because if 500 people have gotten killed in the city of Chicago, and we're not even at the end of the year, and these are Black and brown people, when you take the police, what is it going to look like then? So we need to have a really good message of what we're going to do to replace whatever we take away is not going to make that 500 number this time next year 1,000, because we're the ones that's being affected right now. We're living in this.
And let me say that, so 500 people were killed and the police were there. Like they like, my point is that, like, if the police were effective, would there be less people getting killed? Or are you saying that we're killing each other, so without the police, we're going to kill each other more? I mean, I think there are, and I don't live in Chicago, so I can't necessarily speak to that, but I'm from St. Louis, where, the murder rate is deeply, troubling for our size city. And my mother calls me telling me that she hears gunshots at night. And I can tell you explicitly that the politics around that is that the geospatial agency just moved downtown to St. Louis, clearing 100 acres of land. And in order to clear that land, there was a relationship between the St. Louis mayor, the former mayor, Francis Slade, between Lacey Clay, the former congressman, and between real estate developers and police to police less so that the property values go down so white people can come in and gentrify and get the land very cheaply. So when we look at the way gentrification occurs in communities, there's a close relationship between the way that the police, local government, and real estate development work. There's a federal indictment because of this. And so like, I think that, you know, as you all have put it before, it's often not just that. And I really think that we have, how do we move beyond, you know, thinking that there's something that we have to replace it with? And can we see abolition as not the, like abolition is in part switching the way that we're funding, so that we're not funding police to do all those jobs, and that we don't necessarily have police, but we have more people in the community doing the work of building the relationships that actually prevents the violence. Because in the heavily like armed neighborhoods, and Black folks don't make those guns, we don't put, there's somebody also profiting, and there's like, if you follow the money, like we see that there's interest in Black people having those guns, and it's part of the white power structure. And so that all I'm saying is that like abolition, if we could imagine something different, how do we reverse engineer and work backwards so that communities are empowered, and we can see that there might be a relationship with people dealing with maybe heinous crimes or murder, right? But like for everyday incidents, we don't even need the police. We don't see the police.
Oh, can I speak right there on that? Because I don't want a comment that I just put out there to be misconstrued. So I'm saying with the comment that I just made, when we're living in a community and we have had 500 homicides that happen and we're not at the end of the year, I'm not saying that the solution to the problem is whatever. I'm saying that the community has to be made a part of that discussion. The community has to know that this is what, when we say abolition of the police, this is what we're trying to do. And this is what we're trying to replace the police with. Instead of you doing something to somebody, somebody has an active role or an active participation in what is actually happening. So these communities that are affected, and when you live in the community that this is actually happening, there is a level of fear. You know, people are afraid to go outside. I'm not saying that the reason that people are afraid to go outside has nothing to do with the structure of the way society is, and they've created it that way. I'm just saying that if I'm living in this community and this conversation of abolishing the police is coming up, a concern that I have is what's going to happen to me living here, and are those politicians understanding that these murders are happening in communities of color, and can somebody tell me, you know, how I'm going to be safe in my community when I've just experienced 500 homicides? Not to say that there is not systemic racism or things that are making those numbers the way that they are. But if you're affected by something, your immediate response is, and this is what the politicians are actually doing. They're saying they don't want to defund the police. They don't want to do these things because look at the homicide rate, or look at this, we're going to have an increase in crime. I'm just saying, get the community involved in that conversation and let them know what you're going to do and what you're going to replace the police with allocations of funding and different things like that.
So I just want to quickly point out that the organizers I know in Chicago, like the Black Youth Project, for instance, have a project called We Keep Us Safe, where they work on community alternatives, and they do a lot of base building and organizing that actually responds to those questions. So I would encourage you to check them out. So and that's my point too, is that when we talk about policy and when we talk about practical changes, I promise you there's always somebody in every community who are concerned and doing the work on the ground to respond to those issues. And we always think that it has to be somebody from above or parachuting in or a professor or academic somewhere. And that's not the case. It's just that those people are underfunded and not paid attention to, but keep doing it despite it.
Yeah, and I would like to follow up on this part of the conversation because at some point, all of you have mentioned the importance of involving community in this process. Alex, you also talked about the importance of using community-based approaches in this process of transforming the police or the system in general. So my question is, in this process, what new collaborations or coalitions can and should be built so that you have like a more effective and actually inclusive process? And the question is addressed to anyone who wants to answer.
Let me maybe start with that, and I'll have to go soon, I'm afraid. But it's essential that we figure out how to work with community-based organizing in a productive way. So, David's absolutely right. There are people all across the country who are doing this work right now who don't get the attention, who don't have resources. And we need to avoid the kind of parachuting in problem. As an academic, when I speak to other academics, I say it's essential that you identify who these people are working on the ground and that you take your leadership from them. They should be setting the agenda. They are in the position to do the most effective communication. But what I found is that they often appreciate some help from outsiders in strategically useful ways at particular moments, but that's their decision to make. So I was, before COVID, I was in 25 cities a year, mostly at the request of these kinds of local organizing initiatives. But it was always their decision. What do they need? How can I help them? How can I lift up, use my privileged position to help lift up their voices and help them, find more resources, et cetera.
A follow-up to that, we only have about 5 minutes left, but would either of you like to respond to Alex's comments? Well, let me pose one more question, and this will have to be the last one, unfortunately, because this has been a very rich conversation. So in terms of building collaborations and allowing people who are providing leadership the space to do that, but giving them the help they need and so on. In addition to that, but along with it, it strikes me that we've all been sort of hinting at something that we haven't really gotten to yet, which is that if policing is ever going to be what it should be, or if we're ever going to abolish it, there are all kinds of elements to the superstructure of our society that need to be addressed. Gross inequality in not only socioeconomic terms, but relatedly in terms of education and housing and healthcare and other sorts of things. And so the question here is, what kind of cultural and political imaginaries and policies and structures that lie underneath policing would need to be changed in order to change policing in the radical ways that we're discussing? And I think I'll start with you again, Alex, and then go back to our other two guests.
Yeah, I think if we have a proper historical analysis of the sort of functional purpose and nature of policing, we see that policing is about maintaining order. But that order always serves a set of political and economic interests. usually around regimes of profound exploitation, colonialism, slavery, the creation of a stable industrial workforce. And so ultimately, if we want to reduce the need for violence workers to produce social order, we must address the regimes of exploitation. Now, today we don't have colonialism and slavery in that 19th century sense. We have this kind of neoliberal austerity politics that's producing these problems of mass homelessness and underfunded communities and schools and lack of health care. And then policing is used to put a lid on all of that. So ultimately, we have to address those systems of profound inequality. The fact that, there are billionaires getting rich off of the COVID virus. And this is both a question of economic and racial justice. But my view is, and this is important, is that we can't wait till we end capitalism to begin to address the negative effects of using criminalization. These things are intricately connected, so that our strategy for a broader agenda for liberation must feature, not exclusively, but it must feature this negative role that the criminal justice system plays.
So I'll just go ahead and just add on to that, and I will say that I agree with you wholeheartedly. I think that my focus has always been with the relationship that the police and the law has together, that they work hand in hand. And in order for us to see any significant change, you have to address both the law and the police simultaneously. Because again, the police are able to do these things in these communities, I believe, because they're going under the foundation of law, which is, as you've already pointed out, is really benefiting a certain group of people. These laws are made to maintain the status quo of society the way it is. And so you can't deal with the police independently without dealing with the structure of the law system itself.
Okay, David, we're going to give you the last word here, buddy.
Yeah. So I appreciate being a part of this conversation. I think it's helpful to be in the room with, people from different perspectives. And the last few years, I've found myself mostly in the room with academics and activists. I think that I agree, we have to deal with this interconnection between the law and policing. And I also think that, responding to Alex's comment around, not waiting until we end capitalism. I think that, part of, if we think about abolition is, and particularly abolition of the police, is part of interconnected, hierarchical systems of domination and violence. Ending, dismantling the police is one of the strategies for dismantling capitalism, especially in the way that police are used to protect capital. I think that also the demand of accountability of past acts by the police also as a way to reset and publicly acknowledge and tell the truth about what happened. So for instance, the torture chamber of John Burge in Chicago, who tortured Chicago residents, and then the Reparations Now campaign. Imagine and let's look at the way that truth and reconciliation processes around the country are springing up. Some focused on prosecutorial misconduct, some focused on police violence, some truth and reparations campaign, but in a way that's never happened before. We're seeing communities rise up and tell the truth and use those truths to realign policy and realign those people who are representing us in the lawmaking halls and policy-making spaces, that if they're not aligning with the stories that are being told, we're kicking them out. We're demanding that they leave. And so I think that we're in the last throw of, or at least we're in an era that could be or lead to the last throes of white hetero patriarchal capitalism. And we have, like, the way, if you know, Trump has brought us here to this end, all of the forces that put Trump in power and all of the systems around our nation and world that are sort of in this moment seeing people stand up and demand and say no more, is going to require people who are saying no more to stay there and to continue to show up and do whatever it takes. So I'm excited about this moment, where the demands, the people's putting their body on the line, and not just Black and brown folks, but white folks are right there too.
All right. This has been, I think, a very rich, very, even I would say, inspiring conversation. And it could go much longer, but we need to say goodbye to you all. So thank you to Professor Campbell and Professor Ragland and Professor Vitale for your expertise and your attention to these problems and all your good work. We appreciate your being with us. Thank you so much for giving us this hour.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank
Thank
you.